The President of the United States, George H.W. Bush, met with British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher in Aspen, Colorado, to discuss what to do about the problem in Kuwait. Prime Minister Thatcher insisted that Saddam, another potential Hitler, must not only be stopped, but thrown out of Kuwait so decisively that he would never entertain the idea of doing it again. On August 5, 1990, President Bush declared that America will commit to liberating Kuwait.
Anything of value, especially oil. I pledge here today that the United States will do its part to see that these sanctions are effective and to induce Iraq to withdraw without delay from Kuwait.
When satellite imaging showed 2 Iraqi divisions approaching Kuwait's border with Saudi Arabia, it was decided that beefing up Saudi Arabia's defenses was crucial. If Iraq invaded Saudi Arabia, Saddam could potentially control 20% of the world's total oil supply. Secretary of Defense Dick Cheney traveled to Saudi Arabia to convince Saudi leaders to accept American aid, for the possibility of Iraq also invading Saudi Arabia was high. The King of Saudi Arabia eventually agreed, and American forces, under command of General Norman Schwarzkopf, began mobilizing in Saudi Arabia. Phase 1, the defense of Saudi Arabia, is known as Operation Desert Shield. More than 500,000 American troops were sent to Saudi Arabia, the largest single movement of troops since the beginning of the Second World War. Iraq's invasion of Kuwait had also soured its relationships with other Arab and Western nations. Soon, Great Britain, France, and Egypt also began committing troops to Saudi Arabia. These are the beginnings of the Allied coalition. The premier of the Soviet Union, Mikhail Gorbachev, not wanting to challenge Russia's relationship with the United States, agreed to support this Allied coalition as well. Saddam was both enraged and surprised at this response. The next step was to take back Kuwait. But how? Some believed this could be done by pushing for harder UN sanctions, but there would be no guarantee of results. President Bush met with top military brass to discuss how to take back Kuwait. General Schwarzkopf was concerned that there would not be enough troops to both liberate Kuwait and defeat the occupying force. Colin Powell reassured General Schwarzkopf, "If you are required to go to war with Iraq, you will have the forces that you need." On October 29, 1990, the UN passed Resolution number 674. If Iraq continued to ignore UN demands to leave Kuwait, the UN would take further measures to remove the Iraqi army. 1 month later, on November the 29th, the UN passed Resolution number 678, which established January 15, 1991, as Iraq's deadline for leaving Kuwait. January 15 came and went, and despite being given multiple chances, Saddam still refused to leave. Phase 2, called Operation Desert Storm, began on January 17, 1991. Apache and Pavlo helicopters from Task Force Normandy took out key Iraqi radar sites to make way for the main aircraft attack. 10 F-117 stealth fighters made their way to Baghdad to begin bombing the capital city. Soon after, coalition air forces began bombing targets all over Iraq.
That's what I always had in mind, was looking for tanks. And if you shot it and it blew up, it was a tank. If you shot it and it didn't blow up, we called it an artillery piece. And at night it was kind of hard to tell. Everything kind of looked the same to us. So the targets we were really looking for were the tanks, and the way the Iraqis had them set up, they were in revetments that were basically just a big sand berm shaped like a C, and then the tank with your infrared targeting system, it looked like a box sitting down there. And They would have those, APCs. If anything that was shooting that you knew was alive, then that was a good target to go after. And especially like a AAA piece, because we kind of took that personally. If the guy's shooting back, that was something you want to get rid of.
Over a period of 5 to 6 weeks and more than 100,000 sorties, Iraq became severely weakened after these round-the-clock bombing runs. About 1 week into Desert Storm, airplanners speculated that they could win the war by air power alone. But this turned out to be a miscalculation. Even in the face of all the destruction in Iraq, Saddam and his troops still refused to leave Kuwait. Coalition air forces were running out of targets in Iraq, and the bombing eventually became pointless. A ground war looked increasingly likely. Saddam didn't believe America was ready for another ground war, and that American leaders were still traumatized by Vietnam. Saddam retaliated by firing Scud missiles into Israel with the hopes of provoking an early ground war. But the coalition did not take the bait. On January 29, 1991, Saddam's next move was to deploy 51 Iraqi divisions to take the abandoned Saudi Arabian city of Khafji. Little did the Iraqis know that United States Marines had been monitoring their troop movements, and 2 Marine reconnaissance teams were already in Khafji waiting for them. The Battle of Khafji commenced. The Iraqis came close to capturing the outnumbered Marines trapped in the city, but to Saddam's dismay, the Marines held out just long enough for Saudi reinforcements to arrive, and coalition air support prevented 2 further Iraqi divisions from reaching Khafji. Later, in February, underneath the smoke of burning oil fields, 2 armies faced each other on the edge of battle. At 4 a.m. on February the 24th, United States Marine forces blazed into Kuwait. But surprisingly, there was nowhere near as much resistance by the Iraqi army as had been anticipated. Thousands of Marines poured into Kuwait, but many Iraqi soldiers chose not to attack. The prior weeks of relentless airstrikes demoralized many Iraqi conscript soldiers. About half of the Iraqi army deserted before the Marines arrived, and many others surrendered to the Marines at the first opportunity. According to General Wafiq al-Samarrai, "This wasn't fair to our proud army. Our army didn't believe in this war. It was a dirty war, this war in Kuwait." A sizable amount of the soldiers in the Iraqi army who had previously served in the Iran-Iraq War got fed up with all the fighting. U.S. Marines bulldozed so quickly through Kuwait that General Norman Schwarzkopf became concerned that their progress would compromise his plan to trap and destroy Saddam's elite Republican Guard forces. The Republican Guard was holding position deep in enemy territory. British and American tank forces were not scheduled to attack until the next day, so General Schwarzkopf advanced their attack to 3 p.m. that same day. On February the 25th, U.S. Marines pushed ahead toward Kuwait City and to Saddam's second line of defense, closely followed behind by U.S. Army and British armored divisions. Despite a counterattack personally approved by Saddam Hussein himself, the U.S. Marines gained the upper hand and took Kuwait City. The counterattack was Saddam's last-ditch effort to repulse the Marines out of Kuwait, and when it failed, Saddam had no choice but to begrudgingly order his troops to retreat toward Iraq. It was during this attempt to fall back between February 26th and the 27th that Saddam's retreating army was obliterated by coalition air forces. The aftermath of all this destruction along Highway 80 is remembered today as the Highway of Death. Kuwait had been liberated, and the Allied coalition turned their sights toward Iraq. Saddam's army was crumbling around him, but Americans still had yet to engage the Republican Guard. General Schwarzkopf was not going to allow the Republican Guard to escape and ordered U.S. Army tanks to drive hard into Iraq. The upcoming battle, called the Battle of 73 Easting, was one of the last major tank battles in the 20th century. The U.S. Army's 2nd Armored Cavalry Regiment went toe-to-toe against Iraq's Republican Guard. 9 M1A1 Abrams main battle tanks and 12 M2 Bradley infantry carriers versus Iraqi T-62 and T-72 main battle tanks and BMP-1 infantry carriers. Iraq may have outnumbered the Americans, but the Americans held several distinct advantages. American forces had GPS satellite imaging to avoid getting lost in the Iraqi desert. Sloped or angled composite armor called Chobham armor, which is far more effective at deflecting projectiles. Higher caliber rounds for the M1A1 Abrams tanks compared to what the Iraqis were using. And American tank gunners with thermal targeting systems. The Iraqis, on the other hand, were using older, obsolete Soviet technology for the most part. Iraqi tanks had manual targeting, which is much slower compared to the tech used by the coalition. The main battle tank of the Republican Guard, the Lion of Babylon, was not even a true Soviet tank. The T-72M, or monkey variant of tanks, were exported Polish knockoffs. So why did Saddam decide to fill his arsenal with such ineffective military tech? Well, long story short, Saddam preferred quantity over quality in order to rival neighboring countries like Iran, Saudi Arabia, and Jordan. The coalition's equipment was also newer. Many of Iraq's vehicles used in the Persian Gulf War had already experienced wear and tear from the Iran-Iraq War. The Battle of 73 Easting resulted in a decisive American victory. 28 Republican Guard tanks were destroyed in just 23 minutes. Some of the American service members who participated in that battle have even referred to the engagement as a turkey shoot.